Paul Warner had learned, over years of lonely winters, to stop expecting voices to answer back. The land itself seemed content to stay silent with him. That night, though, as he passed the frozen well by the road's bend, he saw a shape huddled at its edge, small, still, half buried in snow. For a moment he thought it was a trick of light or a forgotten scarecrow. Then it moved. She was kneeling there, arms around herself, a thin shawl pulled tight against the wind. The lantern's glow caught the faint red of her cheeks, the black gloss of her hair crusted with ice. When she lifted her face, he saw almond eyes, wide, afraid, but steady enough to meet his. She looked foreign to this white land, like ink spilled on snow. He stopped a few paces away, words drying in his throat. "Ma'am," he managed finally. Her voice came soft, careful, carrying a melody of another country. "Please, only warmth. One night." Behind her, the sky cracked with lightning hidden inside clouds. Paul saw that her hands were bleeding from cold. The shawl she wore was torn, her boots mismatched. Someone had sent her away in a hurry. He studied her a moment longer, his breath curling between them like a wall. "Town ain't friendly," he said. "Not tonight. Not to strangers." "I know," she whispered. "They told me I should keep walking." Something in the way she said it reached past the winter in him. He nodded once, held out a gloved hand, and she took it like a promise she didn't believe. He helped her onto the horse, climbing up after, the mare shuddering beneath their weight. The lantern's light swung wildly as they rode, tracing two fading shadows through the storm. By the time they reached his cabin, the wind had risen into a howl. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, guided her inside. The room smelled of pine smoke and dust. A single bed, a rough-hewn table, shelves of tools, all worn smooth by years of use and solitude. He knelt to stir the dying embers back to life. She stood by the door, hesitant, as if unsure whether she was welcome even after being invited. The flickering light painted her face in amber and gold. She wasn't young like a spring bloom, but she wasn't old either, just marked by miles, by things unsaid. Paul pointed toward a chair near the fire. "Sit. Warm up." Her lips trembled into something close to a thank you. She sat, hands hovering over the flame, palms thin as parchment. He poured water from the kettle, added coffee grounds by habit, the bitter scent filling the space. "Got bread and beans?" he said. "Ain't much." She shook her head. "Enough." They ate in silence. Snow battered the windows. Once she glanced toward him and said, as if confessing to no one, "I told them the truth, that I cannot give children. They said no man should waste his name on a barren woman." Paul's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slow. The fire popped. Outside, a coyote howled like a ghost losing its way. He met her eyes. "You got a name?" "Mei Young." "Paul," he replied, almost embarrassed to hear his own voice after days of quiet. For a long while, they listened to the wind build against the door. She seemed smaller each time the gust struck, her shadow trembling on the wall like a candle flame about to die. Finally she rose. "I can leave at dawn," she said. "I do not wish to trouble you." He looked at her, then really looked. The thinness of her frame, the way she clutched that shawl like armor, the soft defiance still alive in her eyes despite the cold. He had buried a wife once and a child. He remembered the same look in his wife's eyes before the fever took her, a quiet plea to stay seen even when everything else had gone dark. He cleared his throat. "There's a spare room. You can stay till the storm's done." Her gaze flickered, uncertain whether to believe kindness when it was offered so plainly. She nodded, bowed slightly the way her people might, and disappeared into the small room beyond the hearth. Paul sat alone a while longer. The fire dimmed to coals. He ran a thumb along his coffee cup's rim, the sound faint and rhythmic. He hadn't realized until that night how heavy silence could become when shared with another soul. From behind the thin wooden door, he heard a soft sound, a stifled sob, maybe, or a prayer in a language he didn't know. He stared into the fire, remembering what the preacher once said, "The Lord sends no one by accident." He rose, placed another log on the fire, and set her torn shawl on the chair by the warmth so it might dry by morning. Hours passed. The blizzard pressed against the cabin, breathing and retreating like some great tired beast. Paul dozed in the chair, the lantern's flame shrinking low. He dreamed of snow turning to ash, of voices lost in the wind, of a woman kneeling beside a well. When he woke near dawn, the storm had quieted. The world outside was buried clean and still. He went to check on her. The door to the small room was half open. She was awake, sitting by the window, wrapped in his old blanket. Light spilled over her hair like morning mercy. She turned her head slightly as he entered. "I thought the snow would never stop," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "It stops," he said, resting a hand against the doorframe. "Always does, sooner or later." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds both gratitude and disbelief. Then her eyes dropped to her lap. "You are kind, Mr. Warner. But kindness fades when gossip begins." He said nothing because she was right. He could already imagine the talk in town, the looks, the laughter. Still, he found himself answering softly, "Ain't planning to give him something to laugh about tonight." Her shoulders eased just a little. The wind outside shifted, lifting a trail of snow off the roof like smoke rising from a dying fire. He felt something move in him too, something small, barely breathing but alive. As he stepped back toward the main room, the narrator's voice might have said, if one were listening. He thought the storm had brought her to his door. But later he'd learn, it was grace that did. And from the corner of the small room, Mei Yong whispered a line to the dawn, one he didn't hear yet. "I can't give you children, but maybe I can give you peace." The kettle began to whistle. The snow outside gleamed gold. The story of them had quietly begun. Morning came pale and wide, the kind of light that softened everything it touched. Smoke rose from Paul Warner's chimney like a ribbon of forgiveness against the bruised sky. Mei Yong stood by the doorway, wrapped in her now dry shawl, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. The night had left shadows under her eyes, but something else glimmered there too, a quiet decision to survive the day. Paul hitched the wagon for a trip into town. "Need flour, lamp oil, and some nails?" he said, voice low as gravel. She nodded, understanding she'd been included in the day's errand without being asked. When she climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, he noticed the way she folded her hands in her lap, like someone taught never to take up space. The wheels cracked through the half-frozen ruts, snow melting into thin rivers beside the road. Down in the valley, Cottonwood Town stirred to life, chimneys smoking, doors creaking open, church bell crying for the faithful. People turned as they rolled past, glances sticking like burrs. Paul tipped his hat to none of them. Mei Yong kept her gaze fixed on the reins in his hands. They stopped first at McCready's general store. Paul stepped down, the wood groaning beneath his boots. Mei Yong followed, her steps light, nearly soundless. The door jingled, releasing the warm, dusty air inside. Behind the counter, Laura Hensley looked up from her ledger. Her smile froze halfway. "Well now," she said, voice sweet as spoiled honey. "Mr. Warner. Didn't expect to see you keeping company so soon after the new year." Paul's jaw tightened. "Just need supplies." Laura's gaze drifted toward Mei Yong, taking her in, the plain dress, the careful posture, the foreign stillness that seemed to make every color around her too loud. "I hear tell," Laura murmured. "She was at the boarding house last night. Said she couldn't give no man a child. Poor thing. Can't imagine what good that'll do a rancher." The store went quiet. Even the old scale on the counter seemed to stop creaking. Paul's hand flexed once on the counter edge. "That true, Miss Hensley?" he said evenly. "You spend your prayers measuring folks' worth like flour?" Her face flushed. "No need for sharp words. Just talk is all." "Well," he said, dropping coins onto the wood, "then let's talk about nails and oil instead." Mei Yong stood a step behind him, chin lowered. The murmur started again the moment they left, the way wind starts up after a pause, cruel and restless. Outside the air bit harder. She walked beside him, eyes on the street's mud, until he said, "You don't owe them any shame." She didn't answer. The sound of hammering echoed from the blacksmith's shed down the road. Across the way, a pair of women from the church stopped mid-conversation to stare. Mei Yong's shoulders folded slightly inward. They loaded supplies in silence. At the stable, Sheriff Dalton Reeves appeared from behind the rail, hat low, coat dark with dust. "Morning, Warner," he said. "Heard some talk. Folks uneasy about who you've got up at your place." Paul looked at him square. "Ain't their place to be easy?" "Maybe not. But this town's been touchy since the mining crowd came through. They don't take kindly to anyone looks different." "I don't take kindly to people going cold," Paul said. "She's got a right to a fire same as anyone." Dalton sighed. "Just don't make trouble. I can only look away so long." Paul gave a half nod, climbed into the wagon, and flicked the reins. As they rolled out, Mei Yong whispered, "You shouldn't fight for me. They'll turn on you too." He didn't look at her. Already been turned on. Didn't die from it. Back at the ranch, the sun broke through the clouds, thin gold slicing the white fields. Inside, she began to unpack quietly. Every movement was deliberate, setting the sack of flour by the wall, lining the shelf with tins, folding the new calico he'd bought without comment. She worked like someone grateful for tasks, even small ones. Paul watched her from the doorway. The house, once hollow as an old drum, seemed to hum again. The kettle hissed, the fire popped, her shadow moved across the wall. She turned suddenly, catching his gaze. "Why did you bring me?" "Storm was coming," he said. "But now?" He hesitated, thumb brushing the brim of his hat. "Now I reckon the storm ain't outside anymore." That night, she cooked rice with what little salt they had left. The smell filled the cabin, strange and tender. He'd eaten beans for years, but this was new. They sat across from each other, quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the wind's whisper through the eaves. "Back home," she said after a while, "a woman is worth many things, patience, kindness, skill. But here it is only her belly." He swallowed, his fork pausing midair. "Here," he said, "people forget life can grow other ways." She tilted her head, considering that, a faint smile ghosting her lips. Later, when the moon rose, she stepped outside. The land gleamed silver. From the porch, Paul watched her lift her hands to catch a flake of snow melting on her palm. In that small gesture, he saw something holy, someone still believing in beauty after everything else had failed her. The next day, she went alone to the creek for water. On her way back, 2 women from town crossed her path. One was Laura. "You ought to know," Laura said, her shawl tight around her. "Men like Paul Warner don't stay kind long. Best move on before the talk gets crueler." Mei Young's voice was calm. "Cruelty has many homes. I have lived in worse." Laura blinked, unsure how to answer. By the time she found words, Mei Young had already walked away, the bucket steady in her hands. That evening, Paul returned from fixing a fence to find the cabin clean, a fresh loaf cooling on the table, and a small bundle of herbs hanging above the door. She'd left a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you for the coat. I will earn my keep." He touched the paper as if it were something fragile and precious. The days passed. Slowly, the town's gossip turned from outrage to curiosity. Children followed her at a distance when she came with Paul for supplies, whispering about her songs and her soft voice. The blacksmith's wife, seeing her help an old man who'd fallen near the well, muttered, "Maybe she ain't all bad." Paul noticed these shifts but said nothing. He kept his focus on the ranch, the fences, the horses, the slow rebuilding of a life that had been broken once before. One night, after he banked the fire, he found her sitting near the hearth, sewing a patch into his coat. The thread glowed pale in the lamplight. She looked up briefly and said, "They still stare." "Let him," he said. "I don't want you to lose your peace." He smiled faintly. "You brought it back." The words hung between them, quiet but unmistakable. Outside, coyotes sang under the moon, and the hills echoed their song like an old hymn. She bent her head to her work, cheeks flushed, and he looked away, pretending to adjust the logs. When he finally turned back, she'd finished the last stitch and set the coat aside. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "I will come with you again. I want them to see me standing beside you." He studied her, the firelight flickering in her eyes. Something in him shifted. Respect, admiration, perhaps the first fragile root of love. "All right then," he said softly. "Let him see." Outside, the snow began again, thin, whispering, endless. But inside the cabin, the warmth deepened. The old narrator's voice would have said, "The town measured her worth by what she could not give." He measured it by what she kept giving anyway. And in the stillness before dawn, as the wind turned against the door once more, Mei Young whispered to herself, "Someday they will see. If not through me, then through him." The kettle began to hum again, just as it had the night she arrived, a sound like life trying once more to begin. Spring came quietly, as if afraid to wake what winter had buried. The snow thinned, the soil softened, and thin blades of green began to push through the thawing ground around the Warner ranch. Mei Young rose early each morning, wrapping herself in Paul's old coat before stepping out to greet the new light. The frost on the fences shimmered like spun glass, and her breath drifted away like smoke. She carried a tin pail in one hand, scattering corn for the hens with the other. The air was still cold enough to sting, but it was a living cold now, full of promise rather than punishment. Paul watched her from the porch, coffee steaming in his hands. He had grown used to her presence. The sound of her feet on the floorboards, the way she hummed while she worked, the soft murmur of her foreign prayers before dawn. The cabin no longer echoed when he spoke. Her silence filled it with something gentler than words. One morning he found her planting small herbs in the thawed patch by the window. The seeds came from a bundle she had carried in her shawl since the night he met her. "Mint," she said when he asked. "And thyme. They remind me of home." He crouched beside her, pressing a handful of soil between his palms. Home's a long way, he said. She smiled faintly. Maybe not so far when you remember the scent. They worked together without speaking. When the sun rose higher, she brushed soil from her hands, and for a heartbeat, her fingers brushed his wrist. He felt the touch like heat traveling straight to his chest. She drew back quickly, eyes lowered, but something had passed between them, a spark that neither dared to name. That evening he brought in a small tin box from the barn. Inside lay seeds of his own, corn and beans from last year's harvest. For the garden, he said. If you're still set on staying. She looked at him, then really looked, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the steadiness in his rough hands. I stay, she said simply, her voice soft but sure. The days stretched long. Paul worked the fields while Mei Young tended the house. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he would hear her laughter mingled with the clucking of the hens, and the sound unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He found himself fixing small things around the cabin that hadn't needed fixing. Tightening hinges, mending the porch rail, sanding down the rocking chair she used by the window. Once, after supper, she offered to teach him how to make dumplings. He laughed, claiming his hands were better suited for rains than dough, but she insisted. Together they rolled the thin sheets, her hands guiding his. Too thick, she said softly, pressing her small palm over his. You must feel it breathe. Bread don't breathe, he said. She looked up at him with a half smile. Everything that feeds the living breathes a little. He burned the first batch and she laughed, an honest, light sound that startled them both. For the first time in years he found himself laughing too. It wasn't loud, but it was real. As spring deepened, rainstorms began to roll across the plains. One afternoon, the clouds turned the sky to steel, and thunder cracked above the barn. Paul was outside trying to tie down a tarp when lightning struck close enough to blind him for a second. Mei Young ran from the porch, her dress whipping in the wind. She caught his arm, shouting something he couldn't hear. Together they dragged the hay bales inside as rain began to lash against them. When it was done, they stood in the barn doorway, soaked to the bone, breathing hard. The rain roared so loud it drowned everything but their heartbeats. Water streamed down her hair, down her neck. He reached out without thinking and tucked a wet strand behind her ear. She froze. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then she stepped back, eyes glimmering. We should dry the firewood, she said quickly, her voice trembling. He nodded, stepping aside to let her pass, but his chest ached with the space she left behind. That night the fire burned high. She sat close, drying her hair with a towel. He sat across from her, pretending to read. The silence between them grew heavier with each crack of the flames. Finally she said, When thunder comes, I remember my village. The river would flood every spring. My mother said it meant the earth was washing its pain away. Paul looked at her over the top of the book. You think pain washes off that easy? She smiled faintly. Not easy. But maybe it softens like the ground after winter. He closed the book. I'd like to believe that. Outside the storm eased. The last rumbles faded into the hills, leaving only the soft hiss of rain on the roof. She rose, laid another log on the fire, and turned to him. You're kind, she said quietly. But kindness can be heavy to carry. I don't mind the weight, he replied. Her gaze lingered on him, uncertain and searching. Then she nodded once, as if accepting something neither could name. The next morning, a letter arrived, carried by the stable boy from town. It was from the church women's circle. Paul read it silently while Mei Young stood nearby. The note was brief, written in a prim hand. For the sake of decency, the foreign woman should depart before she shames the community. He folded the letter, fed it straight into the fire. Mei Young's lips parted, eyes wide. You should not have burned it. Didn't need to read it twice, he said. They'll talk either way. But you. He cut her off gently. You already been through hell. You're not walking back there on my account. Her throat tightened, her voice barely a whisper. You do not understand. Their hatred is not small. He met her gaze. Neither is mine when it's roused. The firelight flickered between them, turning his eyes the color of rust and sorrow. For the first time she saw how much pain he carried. A man who'd lost more than one life to loneliness. That night, she left a bowl of soup on the table for him before retreating to her room. The broth was simple but warm. He ate it slowly, his chest heavy with something unfamiliar. When he finished, he whispered into the quiet, Darlin', you already gave me more than I knew I needed. Through the thin wall she heard him. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trembling. The wind outside carried a low hum across the plains, a sound like old music remembered. The cabin held its breath, full of warmth that neither dared to claim. Before she lay down, she glanced out the window and saw him standing by the corral, staring at the sky as if waiting for it to answer something. The old narrator's voice might have said then, "Some loves don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive with silence that feels like safety." And as dawn crept over the fields, she whispered into her pillow, "I was told no man would wait for me." Perhaps they never met one with hands that remember warmth. Summer arrived on a wind that smelled of dust and sun-warmed hay. The hills were gold now, rolling in slow light, the streams low and shimmering. For a while, peace lived easily on the Warner ranch. The hens clucked lazy in the yard, the horses grazed near the fence, and Mei Yong's herbs bloomed in the window box like small defiant miracles. Paul mended fences by day and played quiet tunes on a whittled flute by night, a habit he hadn't touched since before grief took root in him. She would listen from her chair by the hearth, hands folded in her lap, eyes soft as dusk. But peace, as Paul knew, never stayed long on the frontier. It was always borrowed, never owned. The first crack came with a whisper from town. Laura Hensley's tongue had started wagging again, this time not in gossip but in sermons disguised as prayer. "A man of God must not keep sin beneath his roof," she told the church circle. "A woman who can't bear children brings God's silence into a home." By the time the words reached Sheriff Reeves, half the valley had already turned them to law in their own minds. Paul didn't hear until the sheriff rode out one evening, his horse tired, his face grave. "Warner," he said, dismounting, "they're planning a petition. Church wants Mei Yong gone by Sunday." Paul stood by the fence, hammer in hand. The air was still but heavy, the sky the color of brass before a storm. "She's done nothing wrong," he said flatly. Reeves sighed. "Don't matter. They want the town clean before the harvest fair. You know how folks are when they start talking about purity." Paul stared at the horizon, jaw tight. "Then let him choke on their own talk." "Don't be foolish," the sheriff said. "If you stand against them, you'll lose every friend you got left." Paul's hammer came down once more, driving the nail deep into the post. "Ain't got many friends worth keepin', if they measure a woman by her womb." When the sheriff left, Mei Yong came out from the barn where she'd been washing linen. Her face was pale, hands wet. "He came for me," she said quietly. "He came to warn," Paul answered. She shook her head. "No. He came to remind you what they think." He took a step toward her. "You ain't going anywhere, Mei Yong." "I bring you shame," she said, voice trembling. "Already they talk about your dead wife, say you've dishonored her by bringing me into her house." "Let him talk," he growled. But she turned from him, wrapping her arms around herself as if holding in something that might break her apart. "You don't understand. In my old village I was cast out too. Not for sin but for emptiness. A woman who cannot give life, she is treated as death itself." Paul wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck like thorns in his throat. Instead, he reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She didn't flinch, but neither did she lean toward him. They stood in silence, the sun sinking behind them, the fields turning red as blood. That night she packed a small bundle. He found her before dawn, standing by the gate. "Where you think you're going?" he said, breath rough from running. Her eyes glistened in the half-light. "You've done enough. I will not let them hurt you for me." "You think this about kindness?" he snapped. "You think I'm helping you out of pity?" She lowered her gaze. "Then why?" He exhaled long and low. "Because when you're here, I remember what peace sounds like. And I ain't letting them steal that too." A low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. The storm that had been building for days finally broke. Wind rushed through the valley, tearing at her shawl, whipping her hair across her face. "Paul," she said, her voice almost lost to the wind, "you deserve a wife who can give you sons, who can carry your name." He stepped closer, rain soaking them both. "You think that's what I want? I had that once and I buried it in the ground. You think a house full of ghosts is better than a woman who makes it feel alive again?" Lightning flared, and for a moment the world turned white. He saw tears on her cheeks, not from fear but from the truth she didn't want to believe. She looked at him through the storm. "You will lose everything." He smiled then, a tired, aching smile. "Already lost it once. This time I'll fight to keep what's left." The rain came harder. She dropped her bundle, the fabric scattered across the mud. Paul bent, picked it up, pressed it into her hands and said quietly, "You stay. That's final." For a long time she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she nodded and he took her hand, leading her back toward the cabin as the thunder rolled away. When they entered, the fire had gone cold. He knelt to light it again, his hands shaking slightly. She watched him, her expression unreadable. "You'll tire of defending me," she said softly. Maybe, he said. But I'd rather tire from fightin' for something right than rest easy in cowardice. Days passed. The storm gave way to heat. The petition reached 30 signatures but went no further. Reeves quietly refused to deliver it. People still whispered when they passed in town, but they whispered softer now. Some even began to soften themselves. A boy fell ill at the general store, feverish and shaking. Mei Yong, trained long ago in herbs, brewed a bitter tea that pulled him back from the edge. His mother wept when the boy opened his eyes. Word spread. The Chinese woman saved him, someone said, with leaves and kindness. After that, the same folks who once crossed the street began nodding at Paul again, awkward but not hostile. The tension bled out of the air, slow as sap from a wound. One evening, as the heat faded, Mei Yong stood in the doorway watching the horizon. The sky blushed pink. She turned to Paul. Do you regret it? He looked up from sharpening his knife. Regret what? Keeping me here. He studied her face, the tired grace, the way she stood tall even when she felt small. Only thing I regret is not finding you sooner, he said. Her lips parted, but no words came. The quiet between them was deep and alive. Later, while washing the supper dishes, she said suddenly, When I first came, I thought you were a man of few words because you did not care to speak. Now I know you were only waiting to be heard. He smiled faintly. Maybe we both were. The summer's end brought new rhythm to their days. She began visiting the church again, not to worship, but to clean. The same women who'd once called her unholy now watched her scrub the steps in silence. Laura Hensley came one morning, awkward and red-faced. You don't have to do this, she muttered. Mei Yong wrung her rag dry. I know. That's why I do it. For the first time, Laura had no answer. By late August, the ranch was thriving. The harvest looked strong, the horses healthy. Paul caught himself laughing one afternoon when she scolded him for tracking mud through the house. The sound startled them both. That night, they sat outside under a sky spattered with stars. The cicadas droned and the air smelled of sage. He told her about his first wife, how she died in the fever, how the silence afterward almost drove him mad. Mei Yong listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said softly, Then perhaps I was sent to fill silence with something gentler. He turned to her, eyes glinting in the lantern light. Maybe that's what love is, Mei Yong, just someone quiet enough to listen. Her gaze held his for a long moment before she looked away, cheeks flushed. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of the church bell. She stood then, brushing her skirt. Tomorrow the fair begins, she said. I will bake something for the table. He rose too. You think they'll let you? They will eat it, she said with a small, knowing smile. They need not know who baked it. When she went inside, he lingered on the porch, listening to her footsteps fade. Somewhere inside he heard her hum, a tune he didn't know, soft and full of longing. He closed his eyes, letting the sound carry through him. The narrator's voice might have murmured then, they took her pride, her name, her place among people, but not her grace. And grace, once rooted, don't die easy. The moon climbed high and Paul whispered into the night, If they come again they'll have to go through me first. From the open window Mei Yong's voice drifted back, tender and sure, They already did, Paul. And still you stand. The air went still, charged as if the land itself held its breath. In that silence, something unseen settled between them, not fear, not defiance, but the quiet certainty of belonging. Autumn swept across the plains in long golden sighs. The fields bowed heavy with harvest, the air full of chaff and the scent of ripened grain. Mei Yong moved through the days with a quiet steadiness, her sleeves rolled, her hair bound tight. The town's stares had softened into something resembling respect. Some even greeted her name now, though still half-whispered, as if grace was something that needed hiding. She had become the quiet center of the Warner Ranch. The herbs she planted in spring had spread wildly, mint spilling into the dirt, thyme climbing the fence. Paul said little about it, but sometimes when she wasn't looking he'd pause near the garden and breathe deep, the way a man does when something reminds him he's still alive. The nights had grown cool. They worked later than they should, threshing and stacking, chasing the last hours of light. One evening, Paul noticed her stumble near the hayloft ladder, her face pale beneath the lantern's flicker. He caught her arm before she fell. You've been pushing too hard, he said. I am fine, she insisted, brushing straw from her skirt. Don't lie, he said softly. Your hands are shaking. She hesitated, then looked down at her palms, the blisters, the redness. I am not used to plenty, she whispered. It frightens me. He didn't answer, just took her by the shoulders and guided her toward the cabin. "Sit," he said, fetching water. She obeyed, wordless, eyes full of the gentleness she hadn't known how to ask for. When he knelt before her, wrapping a cloth around her wrist, she murmured, "You treat me as if I am breakable." He smiled faintly. "You ain't. But I'd like to keep you from breaking anyway." For the first time she didn't look away. Her gaze stayed on him, steady, as if memorizing something she'd never thought to own: tenderness. Days passed into a rhythm of quiet grace. She rose before dawn, and he began waking early too, just to watch her light the stove. Sometimes they'd share breakfast without words, the sound of the coffee boiling filling the room with a kind of peace that didn't need explaining. Then came the boy. A rider from town appeared one cold afternoon, dust on his boots, a bundle in his arms. Paul met him by the fence, wary. The man, the preacher's nephew, shifted uneasily. "He was left at the church steps last night," he said. "Barely 2 years old. The lady said you might take him. Just until they find a proper home." Paul looked at the child, hollow-eyed, wrapped in an old quilt. "Who told you that?" The man shrugged. "Laura mostly. She said your woman's got a mother's touch even if—" He stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung there. "Even if she can't bear her own." Paul's voice came low. "You can leave him here." When he carried the child inside, Mei Young froze. The boy's small fingers reached toward her face, curious. She hesitated only a moment before lifting him into her arms. He clung to her instantly, burying his face against her shoulder. Her voice was barely a breath. "He is burning with fever." Paul fetched water, soaked a cloth. They worked together through the night, her whispering lullabies, him pacing near the fire, worry etching new lines into his brow. When dawn broke, the fever broke with it. The boy stirred, coughed once, then sighed into sleep. Paul sat back, exhausted. Mei Young still held the child, rocking gently. The first light touched her hair, haloing it in gold. She looked down at the boy with something deeper than joy, reverence maybe, a kind of miracle she didn't dare name. When she looked up, tears traced her cheeks. "Do you see?" she whispered. "God sends life in other ways." Paul couldn't speak. He only nodded. Days became weeks. The boy, they called him Luke, began to laugh again, toddling after Mei Young wherever she went. He followed her into the garden, into the kitchen, even into the barn. She taught him to feed the chickens, to blow on dandelions. When he cried, she sang to him in her own tongue, the sound soft as wind over reeds. Paul watched them from the porch, a quiet ache filling his chest. One evening, as she tucked the boy into bed, he said, "You've got him smiling again." She turned. "He smiles because he knows he is wanted." "You think he'll stay?" Paul asked. "I do not know," she said. "But if he must go, he will go having known love. That is enough." He looked at her a long moment. "You think love can be enough?" She met his gaze. "It was for me." Silence settled, thick with things neither dared say. Weeks later, the preacher rode out himself, bringing word that the child's parents had perished in a wagon wreck. "The church can send him east," he said. "Or, if you wish to keep him, I can make it official." Paul glanced at Mei Young. She was standing in the doorway, Luke clinging to her leg. Her eyes glistened. He spoke without hesitation. "We'll keep him." The preacher nodded, tipping his hat. "Then I'll see to the papers." After he rode off, Paul turned to her. "You all right with this?" Her lips trembled. "I am more than all right." She looked down at the boy and whispered, "He is the seed that never was and yet grew." That night, the three of them shared supper by lamplight. Luke fell asleep in Mei Young's lap, his small hand tangled in her sleeve. Paul sat across from her, watching the soft rise and fall of the child's breath. "Funny thing," Paul said quietly. "I used to pray for sons. Never thought the answer'd come like this." Mei Young's voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe God waits to give us what we can finally see." He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. For the first time, the silence between them felt full, like a promise rather than an absence. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and earth, the smell of endings turning to beginnings. Later, when the child stirred and began to cry, Paul rose first. "I'll get him," he said, but Mei Young shook her head. "Let me." She carried Luke to his small bed, humming softly until he slept again. When she turned back, Paul was standing by the doorway, watching her as if seeing something holy. He spoke in a low, rough voice. "Told you, darlin'. We'd have kids, just took a bit longer, that's all." She smiled then, the first smile that reached her soul. Her eyes shimmered, not with sorrow but with peace. In the quiet that followed, the narrator's voice might have said, "The world once measured her by what she could not give. But he saw what no one else did. That sometimes, love's greatest harvest comes from barren soil. Outside, the stars burned steady over the prairie, and the wind whispered through the wheat like a hymn. Mei Yong stood by the window long after he'd gone to bed, watching the moonlight spill across the child's sleeping face. She touched the glass and whispered to herself, maybe this is how life forgives us, not with miracles but with mercy. And somewhere behind her, Paul's voice drifted drowsily from the shadows. Come on, love. Morning's comin'. World'll need you again soon. She turned, the faintest laugh escaping her lips, and crossed the floor toward him, toward warmth, toward the home that had taken years to bloom. The fire dimmed, leaving only the glow of embers, small, red, and alive.